but let's get underway. So welcome everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about our group and then introduce our august and distinguished speaker, uh, a man of growing fame in the Mormon community, with influence reaching far beyond that of President Nelson within the Intermountain West, sending people into palpitations and I don't know, faints in the church office building.
You've really practiced this introduction, haven't you?
I didn't. This is my sad my sad attempt at improvisation. Okay, so officially here we're going to begin. Founded August 7th, 2020, the Working Group on Mormonism and Western Esotericism aims to promote the study of Mormonism within the context of the Western esoteric tradition, both within academia and among the wider public. Reaching back to Mediterranean antiquity, the Western esoteric tradition here refers to those individuals, groups, and cultural phenomena concerned with the search for higher knowledge, not infrequently in conjunction with the performance of secret rituals that might lead the initiate ultimately to communion with higher realms of existence, or even divinization of the self. Drawing from roots in the Radical Reformation, Freemasonry, and magical practices, early Mormonism represents a synthesis of various strains of esotericism, and thus cannot be fully understood without taking proper account of the esoteric aspects of its origins. To that end, the Working Group on Mormonism and Western Esotericism holds conferences and hosts speakers, as well as participating in the conferences of other organizations such as Sunstone, in order to make the case for the great value of studying Mormonism through the lens of Western esotericism. Tonight, we are fortunate to host Radio Free Mormon, currently one of the most significant podcasters in the Mormon community, appearing both solo and with Bill Reel on Mormonism Live. Most recently, he spoke at Thrive. A member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for many decades, Radio Free Mormon is a true scholar and historian of Mormonism, has published articles on topics of Mormon history, doctrine, and scripture. He is a masterful debater, a marvelous raconteur, and an inexhaustible source of learning and wit. Tonight, Radio Free Mormon will share with us his research on one of the many topics he has illuminated with new insights and discoveries: Hebrew numerology in the Book of Mormon. I now turn the time over to Radio Free Mormon.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Professor Luke. It's great to be here. You know, I'm very nervous to be here and presenting before a bunch of scholars like you people, because I do not consider myself to be fit to black your boots, but I'll do my best, okay? So we're talking about Hebrew numerology in the Book of Mormon. I have to say three things first. First thing is this: I don't think this research would ever have occurred. Actually, I know this research would never have occurred without Don Bradley. Is Don Bradley among us tonight?
I haven't seen him yet.
He's probably out protesting with a sign in front of the building. The deal. No, Don Bradley, he was a co-contributor on this research with me. And this has been almost 10 years ago now, but I cannot even think to begin talking about the subject without talking about Don Bradley and the huge, huge influence he was on this research. I don't think it ever would have happened without him, and it wouldn't have happened as well without him. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that whenever we're talking about numerology in any context and talking about the presence of numerology in a text like the Book of Mormon, it is fraught with difficulties and perils. And one of the first things is that as soon as you're looking for certain numbers, you're going to see them. It's like the old story about the red Volkswagen Beetle on the highway. You don't see any until somebody mentions it, and then you see them everywhere. So that's something that I have tried to guard against. Any story, any narrative that's going to involve numbers of people, numbers of days, everything's going to be numbers. And some of them are going to fit the paradigm you're looking for, and others are not going to fit the paradigm you're looking for. And typically what ends up happening is you focus on the ones that fit and you ignore all the rest, and you end up doing what's, I think, commonly referred to as Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So I've tried to guard against that. And I will say, at least on one occasion that I remember, and I know there's more that I don't remember, Don Bradley served to keep me honest in that regard. And I appreciate him for that. And I think the result is much better for that. Now, the third thing has to do with Hebrew numerology in the Book of Mormon. It is, I believe, accurately titled, but it also has to be added that Hebrews weren't the only ancient culture interested in numerology, and not the only culture that used it. So, and a lot of cultures use similar numbers to the Hebrews. They were not hermetically sealed from other cultures. So what I'm saying could apply to other cultures, but I think the Hebrew has specific relevance here, especially because of Joseph Smith's familiarity with the Bible, where it shows up there a great deal. So having said all that, let me present the overview, and the overview is going to be the whole thing, okay? The overview of this subject, and I'll present the evidence in front of you and let you make your own decision. I think the evidence is persuasive that actually there is intentionality to the use of ancient numerology forms in the Book of Mormon. So here we start, okay? First off, the number 7 is what we're going to be talking about. The number 7 is so popular, it's even in our culture today. We think about lucky number 7. 7 is a number of special significance, not as much today, I think, as it used to be among the ancients. And I have a short list of 7 being used in the Bible in symbolic ways. Number 1, the creation account. Let's start at the very beginning. The creation account, a very good place to start. It's 7 days, right? Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. And let me talk about the number 7, because the number 7 is important for a very specific reason, I believe. And it's because it's the combination of 2 numbers, which is 3 and which is 4. All right. 3 plus 4 equals 7. So from ancient times, it looks like 4 was associated with the earth. And we see that with the 4 corners of the earth, when it was believed to be flat and square-like, the 4 pillars on which the earth stood, the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 winds. You get the idea. That's a pretty easy one for people to grasp as to why 4 was associated with the earth. 3, on the other hand, was associated with the heavens. So you've got 4 for the earth, 3 for the heavens, and I believe there's also a masculine and feminine component to both of those, which we're not going to get into at this point. I'm sure Carrie Schertz will be covering that in an upcoming Backyard Professor video. So 3 plus 4 equals 7. And we started on that list with the creation account. The creation account is 7 days. And when you think about it, some ancient Hebrew sat down at some point to write the creation account. I don't think it was Moses, but it was somebody, and they were steeped in this culture. And when an ancient Hebrew is going to sit down and he's going to write an account of the creation of all things in heaven, 3, and earth, 4, then it would really only be expected. In fact, it's almost ineluctable that the author is going to talk about the creation of all things in heaven and earth in a 7-day period, or a 7 period, creation periods, right? It would be strange if it were any other way, actually. But that's number 1. The creation count is 7 days. Number 2, the sabbatical years every 7th year. These are things that are not a surprise to anyone, I expect. Number 3, God commanded Moses to displace 7 nations from Canaan. That may not be as commonly known. That's Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1. Number 4, Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha, commanded Naaman. Oh, we get this story a lot in the LDS church, at least we used to. He commanded Naaman to wash 7 times in the Jordan River to be cured of his leprosy. Number 5, 7 baskets of surplus food are left after the multiplication of loaves in Matthew chapter 15. We've now gone into the New Testament from the Old Testament, for those of you keeping track. Number 6, Peter asks if he should forgive 7 times. Okay, and he's really not talking, maybe he's talking literally, I'm not sure, but this is supposed to be a fullness of times, a completeness of times, as opposed to just the number 7. And the 7th one in the list is that in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 4, there are, of course, 7 churches that are addressed in that book. So that's my first list of 7 usages of 7 in symbolic ways in the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, let's go to the Book of Mormon for a separate list, because 7 also ends up being used symbolically in the Book of Mormon. Number 1, you remember, of course, that Nephi has a heck of a time with his older brothers, Laman and Lemuel, and they're always going back and forth, and usually Laman and Lemuel get the upper hand, and then Nephi gets miraculously preserved by divine intervention. But if you count them, and I have, but I won't go into that detail here. Maybe if there's a question, if someone cares about it later on, I will refer you to where it is listed. But there are actually 7 rebellions by Laman and Lemuel. They don't necessarily have to be against Nephi, but there are 7 rebellions by Laman and Lemuel as recorded in the book of 1st Nephi. Number 2, there are 7 churches specifically noted in the land of Zarahemla in Mosiah 25:33. There are 7 converted Lamanite cities and lands listed in Alma 23:7-13. By the way, let me just interpose this for a second, is that there are some times in the text, both of the Book of Mormon and the Bible, where it comes out and it tells you, this is the number 7. There are 7 creation periods, for instance. There are 7 years for every sabbatical year, is every 7 years. So it comes out and it tells you the number. There are other places in the scriptures and in the ancient texts where it doesn't tell you it's 7. You have to count it yourself. It's not going to come out and tell you this is 7, but it will give you a list of 7. And those are referred to in the literature sometimes as latent heptads. The latent, of course, being it's not coming out and hitting you over the head with it. You've got to count it yourself, and the heptad being a grouping of 7. So where were we? I think we're down to number 3. Oh, by the way, number 2 on Book of Mormon, 7 churches are noted in the land of Zarahemla. I believe that actually comes out and says there's 7 churches. Number 3, where it says there's 7 converted Lamanite cities and lands are listed in Alma 23 verses 7-13. That one is a latent heptad. And actually, it was those 2 things, the 7 churches noted in the land of Zarahemla, and then the 7 converted Lamanite cities and lands are listed in Alma 23 verses 7-13. That was actually the germ of this entire paper and all this research. Was I had observed that and I thought that was kind of interesting and maybe it meant something, but that's all it was until I brought it up. Don Bradley thought it was interesting and he fanned the flames and made his own contributions, as I've mentioned. Okay, number 4 in my Book of Mormon list, the Nephite monetary system. Remember Alma chapter 11? The Nephite monetary system is based on the number 7. Number 5, there are 7 Lamanites who are killed by Ammon at the waters of Sebus in Alma 18. There are 7 deadly sins of the Nephites that are listed by Mormon in Alma 50 verse 21, another latent heptad. And there are 7 missionary companions taken by Alma to the Zoramites on that mission to the Zoramites, as recorded in Alma 31. So there is my brief list of 7 being used in the Book of Mormon in symbolic ways. So for those of you paying attention, I hope I haven't lost you yet. You probably saw what I did there. What I did was I listed 7 usages from the Bible, 7 from the Book of Mormon, and I ended up listing in total 14 such examples. 2 lists of 7. Why did I make 2 lists? Well, the reason I did that was to illustrate that multiples of 7 are frequently used to enhance the symbolism of the number 7. Doubling 7 to 14 is the numerological equivalent of what we would do when we are maybe writing something in all caps or underscoring something that we're writing or boldfacing for additional significance. So they could double it or they could multiply it by different numbers. We'll see a few of those here in a second. So now let's go to multiples of 7 in the Bible, because we see this there as well. And this is going to be another list of 7. So the first one in this list is Jacob served Laban 7 years for Leah, and then another 7 years for Rachel. Genesis chapter 29. Number 2, Joseph prophesied 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Genesis 41. Number 3, the Israelites under Joshua, they circled Jericho 7 times on the seventh day in order for the walls to come falling down. Number 4, Passover is held on the 14th day of the first month. So Passover being held on the 14th day, I think probably has symbolic significance there. Once again, this might be squishy. I'm not positive, but I give it as an example. Number 5, Solomon has a feast for 7 days and 7 days. That's actually the quote from 1 Kings 8, verse 65. Solomon has a feast for, quote, 7 days and 7 days, even 14 days, end of quote, is what it says there. So they're really trying to make it clear, I think, what they're doing with that symbolism. Number 6, God tells Elisha a remnant of 7,000 faithful Israelites remain. That's in 1 Kings 19. Now, this is a situation where we don't have 7 doubled, but we have 7 multiplied by 1,000 to increase its symbolic significance. Number 7, the last one on the list here, Jesus tells Peter, remember we had on the previous list that Peter asks if he should forgive 7 times, and Jesus's response, which is very famous, Jesus says, no, Peter, you have to forgive 70 times 7. And once again, I don't think that Jesus is saying 490 times if my math is right. I mean, I went into law because I stink at math, but I think that's the answer. 70 times 7, what he's talking about is underscoring the completeness and absoluteness of forgiveness that he has to give, basically as many times as is asked. And I don't think that's a very unusual understanding of that particular passage. So there's the 7 examples there. Now I want to get into, very briefly, the symbolic genealogy of Jesus, because there are 2 gospels, as you know, that give a genealogy of Jesus. It's Mark and it's Luke. Excuse me, it's Matthew and it's Luke. And we're going to talk about Matthew specifically because what Matthew does is very, very interesting. What he does is he does 3 groups of 14, and he extends it back to David. And no, Abraham before David. It goes from Abraham to David is 14 generations, and he lists them all. And that would be, I think it's Matthew chapter 1. Wait, I have it right here. Yeah, it's Matthew chapter 1. It's Luke who does it a little bit later in his gospel. So from Abraham to David is 14 generations. From David to the destruction of the temple by Babylon is another 14 generations. And then from the destruction of Babylon to Jesus is the 3rd set of 14 generations. The thing about Matthew's genealogy, which has long been recognized, I think, is that it is clearly artificial. In other words, Matthew is not really setting forth everybody in this list of genealogy going back to Abraham. What he's really doing is he is using a creative method to arrive at what he wants to have, which is these 3 sets of 14. In Matthew's, for example, in Matthew's 3rd list of 14, between the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians and Jesus, he actually only lists 13 generations. But the author of Matthew insists that there are 14. If you go back and actually count them, there's 13. It's 14, 14, and 13. But the author is so intent on making it 14 that he'll call 13 14 anyway, just to make his point. Additionally, it turns out that Matthew left out some names in the 14 generations from David to the Babylonian disaster. So that would be the 2nd set of 14. This is just an example. In chapter 1, verse 8 of Matthew, Matthew indicates that Joram is the father of Uzziah. But we know from 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, that Joram was not Uzziah's father, but was actually, at least according to that record, his great-great-grandfather. In other words, Matthew has dropped 3 generations from the genealogy. Why? The answer should be getting obvious by now. If he included all the generations, he would not be able to claim that something significant happened at every 14th generation, because this is one of the main points he's making. Every 14 generations, something very important happens, and he proves it from Abraham to David and from David to the Babylonian destruction. Well, it's been 14 generations since then, and something very important is supposed to happen, and that important thing is Jesus. That's the point he's trying to make there, I think. So What Matthew's doing is he's teaching that God is in control of the history of Israel. He's teaching that every 14th generation, something of immense significance happens. And Matthew is consciously constructing his narrative to teach something much more important than a dryly accurate genealogy. He's trying to teach something with symbolic usage of numbers. And excuse me, hang on just a second here. Sorry, just coughed. I get pretty good at using the mute button. So Matthew's teaching this more profound truth than simple accuracy. Matthew is teaching the deep truth of God, and he's using numerology to do it. And one of the things that's important, and it will be very important in the second half of this discussion, is this very, very thing, which we can find an example of here right in Matthew, which is, we know from looking at the Old Testament text, which Matthew was probably using in order to construct his genealogy, that there is something that is historically accurate. It's the real world. I'll put that in somewhat air quotes, but the real world has a different genealogy that isn't going to make the point that Matthew wants to make. So what he's doing is he's superimposing upon the real world a different format and changing it up a bit, specifically in order to arrive at the symbolically significant number that he wants to arrive at. So what this shows is authorial intent and creativity. It didn't happen by accident. This is something that the author of Matthew planned and worked to have it come out the way he wanted. And it's rare that we can find this in the scriptures, because in order to find this, what we have to have is two things. We have to have the actual historical record in the scriptures, and we also have to have an account of someone monkeying with it in order to make it numerologically significant and make it a different number. And as you can imagine, that probably doesn't happen an awful lot. We might have certain times where something's historical and we don't have anybody changing it to make it numerologically significant. Or we might have something that maybe is numerologically significant, but there's no place where we can look at what the actual history was. And that's one of those things that I talked about earlier. Even the creation account, right? We don't have anybody saying, well, it was actually this period of years, millions of years. But all we have is what is very apparently the symbolically created account, without something in the real world in the scriptures to compare it with, to see how it's being used by the author to make it significant. And this is something, back to Matthew's genealogy. This is a quote from Bart Ehrman. This was from his book, Jesus Interrupted, pages 57 and 58. And he noted the same thing. What he said was, Matthew's genealogy of Jesus stresses the numerological significance of Jesus's ancestry. From Abraham to David, Israel's greatest king, there were 14 generations. This is still quoting from Ehrman. From David to the destruction of Judah by the Babylonians, Israel's greatest disaster, there were 14 generations. And from the Babylonian disaster to the birth of Jesus, 14 generations. 14, 14, and 14, Dr. Ehrman says. It is almost as if God had planned it this way. In fact, for Matthew, he had. After every 14 generations, an enormously significant event occurs. This must mean that Jesus, the 14th generation, is someone of very great importance to God. I will insert here parenthetically that in the other gospel account, Luke, that mentions the genealogy of Jesus, he does it differently. He doesn't go back to Abraham. He goes all the way back to God through Adam. And I set myself down and counted the generations, and it may be more than coincidence that the author of Luke comes up with 77 generations between Jesus and God being the father of Adam, right, as it's said there in that genealogy. Okay, so having set that groundwork, by the way, can I mention something else? We all know that 12 is a very important number in ancient Hebrew numerology. There's 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, maybe in some sense based on that or deriving from that, and the 12 princes of each tribe, one prince for each tribe. In fact, we understand, at least in one of the Gospels, that the apostles were thought to be the ones who would judge the 12 tribes of Israel. So 12 is a very important number throughout. And although I've never seen it in my research, I'm sure it's out there somewhere. I doubt that I'm the first one to come up with this idea. I think 12 is important to the ancient Hebrews for the same reason that 7 is. But whereas 7 is 3 plus 4, 12 is 3 times 4, or 4 times 3. And I think that it's quite possible that that's why 12 becomes such an important number to the ancient Hebrews, simply multiplying instead of adding. Okay, so let's look to the Book of Alma. Something similar happens with the construction of the Book of Alma. There are 3 sets of 14 years that the book seems to be structured around. The first 14 years cover Alma's activities among the Nephites. Remember, right at the beginning of Alma, Alma says, I'm tired of being the chief judge. I'm just going to restrict my duties to being high priest. And he goes off around to the different churches, the 7 churches amongst the Nephites, and he preaches there with one degree of success or another. And that's Alma 1 through 16. Now, the next section covers the same 14 years, but it's in a flashback. And in that flashback, it's covering the same period of time that the first 16 chapters of Alma are covering, focusing on Alma. But now we're talking about the sons of Mosiah and what they were doing during that same 14-year period. And that is from Alma 17:5 through 27:16 that we get their exploits, the sons of Mosiah. We know both periods are 14 years because the book of Alma begins with the first year of the reign of the judges. As I said, Alma has just assumed the offices of both chief judge and high priest, while the 4 sons of Mosiah have headed off to preach the gospel to the Lamanites. I think we probably all know the story. But when Alma happens to meet the sons of Mosiah in Alma 17, we are expressly told by the text that the sons of Mosiah had been teaching the word of God for the space of 14 years among the Lamanites. So there's the key. That's Alma 17, verse 4. It tells us not only that the mission of the sons of Mosiah to the Lamanites lasted 14 years, but also that the account given of Alma's activities after the sons of Mosiah left also has to be 14 years. So now we have 14 years doubled by means of this flashback. We recall that Matthew mentions 14 generations of Jesus 3 times for emphasis. The book of Alma may do something similar because it isn't done with the number 14 yet. Now we get to the last half of Alma, which I think every member of the church who has read the Book of Mormon knows is packed full of the war chapters. In fact, that's what it's called, is the war chapters. Well, as it turns out, when you count those years that are the war chapters, that's another set of 14 years. I counted this and I found it out for myself. And then with further research, I was surprised to see other people had noticed it before. I think Hugh Nibley had also mentioned that this was a 14 years war between the Nephites and the Lamanites. So he had counted it up as well. For reference, the period of the wars begins in the commencement of the 18th year. So the beginning of the 18th year of the reign of the judges, that's Alma 43:4. And it continues through to the end of the 31st year of the reign of the judges. And that's Alma 62:39, right at the end of the book of Alma. So that is 14 years expressly mentioned. It's not stated that this is 14 years, but if you actually count from the time it starts to the time it ends, it's 14 years. So we see that the book of Alma appears to be structured around 3 sets of 14 years. Alma's 14-year ministry among the Nephites, the concurrent 14-year ministry of the sons of Mosiah among the Lamanites, and the 14 years of war between the Nephites and the Lamanites. So as with Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, the author of the book of Alma appears to structure the narrative to present 3 sets of 14. Now I have to add here, by the way, it looks like Don Bradley has entered the waiting room. Should I admit him? I'm going to admit Don. I just admitted him. Don, are you there? Don? Hello, Don. Well, hopefully he's listening. I want to make sure that he knows that I raised him up the flagpole and saluted him at the beginning of this. Okay. Well, I can't hear him. He's a shy sort, retiring. All right. So Don, I talked all about you at the beginning and what an incredible scholar you are,
Oh.
and how this wouldn't have existed without you,
Oh,
and your expertise, your brilliance.
oh, thank you.
Okay, I just wanted, because you missed it, and I didn't want you to not know that.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, it's been all downhill since there. Okay, so now we're to the part that I really think is the really interesting part. By the way, talking about the structure of Alma, it's not perfect in the sense of these 3 sets of 14 years doesn't really account for everything in the Book of Alma, because there is a period, I think it's 3 years in between those 2 concurrent ministries of Alma and the sons of Mosiah and the starting up of the wars. So there's 3 years there. You could say it's 3 years of peace. 3 years is an important number. I bring it up just to say that it's not a perfect set of 3 sets of 14. There's a 3-year period in between that's not accounted for in this analysis. Okay. But now we get to the really, really interesting part. And this is where I find the evidence to be persuasive to me. The crucial test, I think, is like what we saw with Matthew in the genealogy, where an author takes something that is, he's got the real world, he knows what the number is. The number isn't symbolically significant enough to suit his purposes, so he changes it and he makes it something different for symbolic effect. We already talked about that, but I believe that there are 3 examples of this that I see in the Book of Mormon. And like I said before, this tends to indicate that the author is doing this on purpose. And once again, you're going to have relatively few instances, because you got to have the real world and you got to have the symbolic world, both mentioned in the same text to compare. And I think we have 3 of those in the Book of Mormon. The first one is the 7 tribes of the Book of Mormon. Early on in the Book of Mormon, the Lehite tribes are numbered at 7. This is Jacob chapter 1, verse 13, consisting of the Nephites, Jacobites, Josephites, Zoramites, Lamanites, Lemuelites, and Ishmaelites, a latent heptad. It is 7. The only problem with this is that we all know that there were not 7 Lehite tribes. There were 8. Who's missing? If anybody said Sam, that's the answer. Right, Sam's missing. Sam is like the shadow figure in the Book of Mormon. We don't know hardly, we know hardly anything about him except for the fact that he exists. And I remember mentioning this to a friend of mine, I think it was just last week. And the friend said, well, Sam didn't have any descendants. And I said, yeah, he did. In fact, the Book of Mormon says he did. So we know that Sam had descendants, and hence there should have been a Samite tribe. And that's 2 Nephi chapter 4, verse 11. So what the author has done here is the author has taken 8 tribes and consciously reshaped the narrative, apparently in order to make the number of tribes tally to the symbolically significant number of 7. So the question then also becomes to me, well, did the author just make a mistake? I mean, Sam is not an important figure. Did the author just forget Sam? Is this something that is not intentional? It's actually just negligence on the part of the author. Well, actually, the text answers that question for us, because according to the text, no, the author did not forget Sam. This is no mistake. The author recognizes that Sam has descendants and would therefore have a tribe. But instead of counting Sam's descendants as an 8th tribe, the author provides a reason for not including Sam. And the author writes, and this is 2 Nephi 4:11, that Sam's seed shall be numbered with Nephi's seed. Nephi's there in brackets in my quote. Because what that verse says is, blessed art thou and thy seed. So this is Lehi blessing Sam. Patriarchal blessing time, right before Lehi shuffles off this mortal coil. Blessed art thou and thy seed, Lehi to Sam, for thou shalt inherit the land like unto thy brother Nephi, and thy seed shall be numbered with his seed. That's where we know that Sam did have descendants. And thou shalt be even like unto thy brother, and thy seed like unto his seed, and thou shalt be blessed in all thy days. By the way, that is actually a chiasmus, if anybody cares. It's a very nice little chiasmus. And I have it diagrammed here in front of me. I should have had a slide. I'm sorry, I was too lazy to bring up a slide, but everybody here knows what a chiasmus is. So let me just say, first line, blessed art thou and thy seed, for thou shalt inherit the land like unto thy brother Nephi, and thy seed shall be numbered. That's the end part of the turning point of the chiasmus. And thy seed shall be numbered with his seed. So now we're coming back and repeating seed. And thou shalt be even like unto thy brother, which matches, for thou shalt inherit the land like unto thy brother Nephi. And thy seed like unto his seed, which goes back to matching and thy seed. And then finally, and thou shalt be blessed in all thy days, which ends where it starts with blessed art thou. So that's 2 Nephi 4:11. It really jumped out at me when I was looking at this closely. And I was looking at it closely mainly because I was doing this research. I'm going to skip that. If it comes up in questions, that's fine. I'm really, really trying just to give the brief outline. Okay, now this isn't something that we just see with tribes in the Book of Abraham. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about Friday already. But the Book of Mormon, because it also happens in the Old Testament. The Old Testament has an insistence that the tribes of Israel be numbered at 12. Once again, 3 times 4. And though Jacob had 12 sons and each son had a tribe, thus making the 12 tribes of Israel, the numbering became more difficult when Joseph had 2 sons, because Joseph is obviously one of those 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel. But he has 2 sons that are given special preeminence in the record as we have it, and that's, of course, Ephraim and Manasseh. Both Ephraim and Manasseh were given tribal land shares in Canaan, which effectively raises the total number of tribes from 12 to 13. And that's when we omit Joseph, because they're already omitting Joseph to make room for the 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But even omitting Joseph, it raises it from 12 to 13. You get an additional one when you take out the 1 Joseph and add the 2 Ephraim and Manasseh. So now we've got 13 tribes. Well, that's not going to do. We need to keep it at 12 tribes. So in order to maintain the number of tribes at the symbolically significant number of 12, the tribe of Levi was excluded when Ephraim and Manasseh were mentioned as separate tribes. And there's 3 references for that. I'll give it really quick. Numbers 1:32 through 34, Joshua 17:14 through 17, and 1 Chronicles 7 and 20. So this modification of 13 tribes back to 12 was justified by the fact that Levi's descendants did not receive a land inheritance because they served at the temple as the priestly tribe. So what it appears is that the Old Testament modifies the figure of 13 tribes to 12 in order to maintain this important number, just as the Book of Mormon modifies the figure of 8 tribes, or the number of 8 tribes, to 7, omitting the tribe of Sam, which the Book of Mormon goes out of its way to draw special attention to by pointing out that Sam's seed is being numbered with Nephi's. And this appears to be precisely the kind of superimposition of Hebrew numerology on the real world information of a text we would expect to see by an author familiar with, if not maybe immersed, in a culture similar to that of the ancient Hebrews. Okay, I find this remarkable. And the Book of Mormon, by the way, for no extra charge, the Book of Mormon lists these artificial, though numerologically portentous, 7 Lehite tribes 3 times over the course of the Book of Mormon. So we know that 7 is not exactly the real world, but it's the 7 tribes they want to have. It's listed 3 times. And as I say, it's through the course of the Book of Mormon. And those references are Jacob 1:13, 4th Nephi 1:37 through 38, and Mormon 1:8 and 9. So something really does appear to be going on here, and it doesn't look like it's coincidence anymore. I think the stuff about the structure of Alma with the 14s, yeah, that could be coincidence. But when you start looking at this, it appears that there's an intelligent author changing things to make things symbolically significant, regardless of where it comes from, the old world or 19th century. Somebody's doing it on purpose. That's my take. And I think that one example would tend to prove that point pretty conclusively, but there's more. The second one, which is probably not so well known, the story is it's the 7-year food supply in 3rd Nephi. You remember the story about the Gadianton robbers, and they become this huge threat to both the Nephites and the Lamanites. So the Nephites and the Lamanites say, we're getting killed out here. So what we need to do is we need to gather together in one place and not farm out there, because when they're farming, that's where the Gadianton robbers are coming in and stealing. And that's how the Gadianton robbers are subsisting, is off the work of the Nephites and the Lamanites. So the plan was, we'll get together in one place, we'll sort of have it barricaded so that the Gadianton robbers won't be able to feed off of our farm and our crops and our livestock, whatever that might have been. But they're going to do this for 7 years. So they take a 7-year food supply with them. Let me see here. This is 3 Nephi chapter 4, verse 4. And the language is, having reserved for themselves provisions and horses and cattle and flocks of every kind, that they might subsist for the space of 7 years. So very specific, the 7 years. But later on, the text tells us that in the real world, this siege, the self-imposed siege that the Lamanites and Nephites did, actually lasted longer than 7 years. The siege lasts between 8 and 9 years, not 7. And we find that in 3 Nephi chapter 3, verse 22. And actually, I'm thinking that that might be earlier. Yeah, 3 Nephi 3:22 and 3 Nephi 6:2. So it's earlier and later. Okay, so here's what we find in those two references, that the siege lasts from the latter end of the 17th year, that's 3 Nephi 3:22, until the Nephites return to their own lands sometime in the 26th year. And even then, they had not eaten up all their provisions, is what 3 Nephi 6:2 tells us. So in this other instance, is this the author consciously manipulating real-world information of provisions for an 8 to 9 year siege, and still having some left over, remember, by reducing the actual time period to the symbolically significant period of 7 years? It looks like the same kind of thing is going on. And the thing that makes this a little bit squishy is that when you're taking provisions that are actual animals that reproduce, like horses and cattle and flocks of every kind, then, I mean, they're having, I almost said children, but they're presumably reproducing. And so there's certain squishiness to how long that's going to last. If they reproduce well, then you're going to have food for longer. But the text itself says 7 years of food supply for this, the siege. And yet, when you look at the text talking about how long it actually lasted in the real world, it's longer than 7 years. It's actually between 8 and 9 years. And we can't get any more definite as to how long between the 8 and the 9 years, because the text does not give us that information. Okay. So now the third one, and this is the final one, by the way. I think you'll be glad to hear this. This is something in Alma chapter 51. It's when the Lamanites are beating the heck out of the Nephites during these wars. And they're just taking city after city after city. I think this is under Amalickiah, before he gets killed by Tankum and his brother Ammoron takes over. But the first time I'm reading the Book of Mormon, I actually noticed this, and I have to give myself credit for that because I'm 18 years old and I wasn't noticing a whole lot as far as details went. But I was watching or reading it closely enough to see that something funny happens. This is going to be in Alma chapter 51, verses 23 through 26, which I'm going to read in its entirety. On its face, it's very simply listing 7 cities that Amalickiah is taking from the Nephites. But something else more interesting is going on underneath. And it came to pass that the Nephites were not sufficiently strong in the city of Moroni. Therefore, Amalickiah did drive them, slaying many. And it came to pass that Amalickiah took possession of, here's number 1, the city of Moroni. Yea, possession of all their fortifications. And those who fled out of the city of Moroni came to the city of Nephihah. And also the people of the city of Lehi gathered themselves together and made preparations and were ready to receive the Lamanites to battle. But it came to pass that Amalickiah would not suffer the Lamanites to go against the city of Nephihah to battle. Now keep your eye on the city of Nephihah, because this next part made no sense to me when I was 18, and it makes no sense to me now. at least in a real world kind of discussion. Because right after it says that Amalickiah would not suffer the Lamanites to go against the city of Nephihah to battle, but kept them down by the seashore, leaving men in every city to maintain and defend it. The very next line is, and thus he went on, taking possession of many cities. The first one listed is the city of Nephihah. So right after saying, we're not going to go against Nephihah because it's too strong, then it continues with its list of cities that were taken, and the next one is Nephihah, which seems strange. It seems counterintuitive to have Nephihah listed as a city there. But you remember earlier on, number 1 was the city of Moroni. Now number 2 becomes the city of Nephihah, and 3, the city of Lehi, and 4, the city of Morianton, and 5, the city of Omner, and 6, the city of Gid, and 7, the city of Mulek, all of which were on the east borders by the seashore. Okay, so that's all those verses, 51 of Alma, chapter 51, verses 23 through 26, and that's 7 cities. But what the heck is going on with Nephihah? Something strange is happening here. There's part of the story that we're not getting. And what makes this even more interesting is that later on in the text of Alma, we find out that Nephihah was not actually captured by the Lamanites until 5 years later. When Ammoron, remember Ammoron succeeds his brother, Amalickiah, when Ammoron sent his armies against it. That's Alma 59, verses 5 through 12. I'm not going to read all of that. You're welcome. But yeah, so why is it that this list of 7 cities is including the name of Nephihah, a city, being taken by the Nephites, when first off, the text itself says that it was too strong to go against, and then later on we find out it wasn't taken at this time. It wasn't taken until 5 years later. Well, that raises the question in my mind. The answer is apparently that the author wanted to have a list of 7 cities and not 6 that were taken by the Lamanites. So here, 6 would be the real world number of cities taken, but the author doesn't want 6. 6 will not do. He wants 7. And the author was willing to sacrifice chronological accuracy and even the textual flow of the story in order to do so, in order to make the number of cities arrive at 7. So here appears to be a third example in the Book of Mormon of the author consciously shaping real world information in order to arrive at the symbolically significant number of 7. Conclusion. We know that the number 7 and its multiples were very significant in the ancient world, including among the writers of the Old and New Testaments. We know that the number 7 and its multiples also appear to be of symbolic significance in the Book of Mormon, which purports to derive from the same old world milieu as the Bible, and certainly had as its immediate author, Joseph Smith, someone who was apparently very familiar with those types of things. Although if Joseph Smith were the author, it would seem that he was more familiar with it than many might originally have thought or believed. But most importantly, for my purposes, the Bible contains instances of the author consciously and intentionally manipulating real-world information in order to arrive at a symbolically significant number. This is more than mere coincidence and indicates not only an understanding and appreciation for old world numerology on the part of the authors, but a willingness to superimpose that numerology on historical events to change the tally to the desired symbolic number. If my analysis is correct, and I'll leave that judgment to you, the Book of Mormon appears to do exactly the same thing. So regardless of one's opinion as to who wrote the Book of Mormon, the text itself seems to show sure and unmistakable signs that the author or authors were not only aware of the significance of this old world numerology as it existed among the ancient Hebrews, as well as others that I mentioned, but intentionally and consciously incorporated that numerology into the warp and woof of the Nephite record. Period. End of presentation. Thank you for your attention. I hope some of you are still awake.
Bravissimo, bravissimo, encore, encore.
Okay, I've got another one.
I was kidding.
Okay, I thought you were. So I look so red here. I can't believe I look red. My light is actually yellow.
You look
So
pink.
I'm pink. I just, I have no idea what's going on. I don't usually look this way, but it's probably because of the nerves.
Pinky
Seven Shades of Pink.
Cuscadero.
It's one of my favorite movies. 40 Shades of Pink.
Trevor shifted now, but he had a perfect halo over him when he was. There we go. That's better.
Yeah, there you go. Holy
So
Trevor.
there we
Matthews.
have it. What do you think? And what are your questions?
The 2 sevens was new to me. That was interesting. The list of 7, 14 being as interesting as 12 and 7. So thanks, RFM and Brad.
Yeah, that
Well,
was
Don Bradley.
interesting. Seeing the groups of the numbers. Really, definitely, you have just given me extra ammo for my presentation.
See, now he's extended beyond the live chat. Now he's going to be doing plugs for his show, his podcast, just right out here in the comments. He's just going to be talking about it. Go ahead.
Two
That's the
hands.
Backyard Professor. It's available at
Two
Mormon
hands.
Discussions podcast.
Not
And he
nearly
does a
as good-
fantastic job, by the way. I
not
love.
nearly as good as Mormonism Live, however, and Bill Reel.
Okay, well,
But I'll
some things
get
go.
there eventually.
Some things go without saying, Carrie. But no, you're wonderful. I love watching you out in the wilderness in God's nature and fighting off the mosquitoes and the occasional mountain lion while you're recording.
Raid before videoing is my motto.
That is a very, very good idea. Yes, it is.
So are there other questions that members of the audience who have not spoken up yet would like to ask our speaker?
I
You
have a
can-
question. Before,
Yeah.
I have a question before Carrie goes because he might take all the rest of the time. Anyway, so I'm just wondering, and I'm going to kind of assume here that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you think, whether this use of Hebrew numerology comes from Joseph Smith's actual acquaintance with Hebrew numerology, or just with the fact that he encounters all the sevens in the Bible and kind of imitates that.
That is a great question, Cheryl. And I'll tell you, I don't know. If it were just the number 7 showing up an unusual amount of time, or even 14 maybe, showing up more than it should statistically in the Book of Mormon, I would feel more comfortable chalking that up just to, well, it's an important number, and I know it's an important number, so we'll use it a lot. But somebody went to the effort and had the mental cognition and awareness to replicate what we see on very few occasions in the Bible of changing real world information to a numerologically significant number. And I guess all I can say is whoever did that, I'm impressed. This never would have occurred to me to do or to even think of doing before I did the research for this paper. And in complete transparency, ironically, this was published in 2014. I have referred to this as the Holy Grail of Book of Mormon apologetics, and only partly tongue-in-cheek, okay? But the irony and the reality is that, you know, I mean, we worked on this for like a couple of years before it was published in BYU Studies in 2014, but the irony was that as this was coming out, this paper was coming out, I was on my way out. So whatever the force of this to an individual's mind as to the provenance of the Book of Mormon or the complexity of the Book of Mormon, all I can say is it wasn't enough to take me back or to hold me in.
All right, RFM, up your game and maybe it'll fix us. Take the Hebrew translation of the Book of Mormon and let's do Grammatia on it. Find some interesting stuff.
Do you say gematria?
Yeah, I probably didn't say that right. I think you know what I meant. Hebrew mathematics against the the characters' values, in addition being Bible code type hidden messages.
I think that'd be fascinating.
I've
What?
heard it pronounced as gematria, but
Yeah.
Ah, there you go. There you go.
Well, Carrie's known for mispronouncing technical terms.
Oh, I'm the idiot here.
No, I have no idea. I have no idea. I mean, I say Dionysus. And you say something different, don't you, Carrie?
Yes.
I mean, recently, over and over in your most recent podcast, right? So I don't know, because it's all Greek to me.
I see what you did there.
Thank you. But I think that would be what Chad suggests would be a great idea, except I think we have a problem at the outset because we don't have an original text of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
No, but don't we have it in Hebrew? Haven't they translated into Hebrew?
It
Sure.
was. It was. And Sammy Hanna was the one who did that. Was that back in the 60s or the 70s? And that's what got him converted to the church,
Yeah.
which he subsequently left. And we used to hear about the first part of the story, but never about the last part of the story.
No, he really did leave. Really?
Well, yes, he did. But in
I
church,
didn't know that. Right.
in church, we heard the
right.
first part of the story. And I think it was not then president, but Elder Russell M. Nelson, who referred to it in one of his talks. So I think he was involved in some way. So he talked about him joining the church because he was just so overwhelmed with the fact that the Book of Mormon translates back into perfect Hebrew, but even that didn't last for Sammy Hanna.
So I've got a question really quickly from the chat. This is from Corey and Katie. So I'm reading their question here. Have you discovered what messaging might be behind any of these instances of the magic number 7?
Well, I will tell you that I don't view it as magic, though certainly some people do and some cultures do, as a magic number with power and significance. I'm looking at it more in terms of just a literary construct and a literary feature to emphasize completeness and fullness. I haven't looked at it in terms of there's some kind of magic. I don't really see, or I haven't seen, any usage of it to convey magical properties, but more as a literary technique to underscore how important this is and how complete and full and wonderful it is. And maybe God inspired it is.
May I ask a question from the opposite end? I'm going to play devil's advocate with you for a second. You mentioned, at least you've described, 2 instances where the numbers were manipulated, possibly 3 in the Book of Mormon, but considering the size of it, couldn't that just be chalked up to, I mean, why aren't there more? If they were going to make that big deal about it and they wanted to emphasize it, being scattered hither and yon to the Book of Mormon doesn't impress me at all. But if it was more systematic, regular, especially with truly significant times in the Book of Mormon, say like Christ showing up and stuff like that, wouldn't that have helped the Book of Mormon better?
Well, just so you know, I'm not trying to help the Book of Mormon, and I know you don't mean it that way, Carrie.
What?
No, I'm not trying to help anybody.
Well, then what the heck?
But here's what I'm going to say in response to you, because that's a great question. And this is why I emphasized or tried to emphasize before the fact that this is such a rare combination of events where you have in the same text both the real world number and then the symbolic number. And that's going to happen very rarely. In the entire Bible, which is a lot bigger than the Book of Mormon, Old and New Testaments, I think that really, I mean, all I've seen or found are the instances of the 12 tribes of Israel becoming 13, but made 12 again. In the Old Testament, because you've got both of those. And in the New Testament, the genealogy of Matthew.
So that's not a lot of instances either. All right,
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So actually the Book of Mormon, a smaller book, apparently has 3, at least that I've identified. And the Bible may have 2.
Yeah, right. All right.
So once again, the Book of Mormon beats the Bible.
Okay, and we have a question from Nolan King. Go ahead, Nolan.
Okay. Sorry, I'm a little nervous to talk. I'm new here. The question about it showing up in the coming of Christ, I noticed this recently when you factor in the 4 classical elements. In 3rd Nephi, the 4 classical elements are used for the destruction and it makes a big deal of this.
You're
That
talking about earth, wind, fire, and
earth, wind, fire,
water?
and water. It makes a big deal of this in 3rd Nephi, that the 4 classical elements are what do the destruction. And then there's the voice comes 4 times describing this, and only on the 5th time, when Christ is actually heard, well, the Father's heard through the Spirit. And like you're talking about in the beginning, the 3 represents heaven. So the 5th element in the classical elements embodying that 3 of heaven. So only on the 5th time that the voice comes do they Holy Ghost. So you have the 4 elements, and then inside the 5th element, the heavens speak. So that's your 7 in the 3rd Nephi. And so that, to me, that's, speaking through the 4 elements and then through the 3 of heaven. And the voice comes 5 times, 4 representing the destruction, and the 5th element, or in ancient times, the ether. And we have a book of ether. And I would say that same thing, it plays out in the book of ether with the coming forth of the Urim and Thummim. The brother of Jared, he takes of the earth, the ore. He uses the wind with the bellows to blow the fire. And then you immerse the Urim and Thummim in the water. So that's your 4 elements. And then you have the Father, Son, Holy Ghost appearance that gives the spiritual 5th element, that sealed portion of that ether that comes into play with the creation of the Urim and Thummim. Same happens with Nephi. When he's creating the tools in 1st Nephi, he does the same steps. He takes the ore, he makes the bellows, blows the fire, immersion in water. And then he has the Spirit come, and he's imbued with the powers of heaven, that Father, Son, Holy Ghost. That's the 7. So like you said in the beginning, you have 4 and 3, the 4 physical elements, and the 5th element being that the heavens, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And that comes into play, to me, in the most significant portions of the Book of Mormon, in 1st Nephi, 3rd Nephi, and then the Urim and Thummim. That, to me, those are that 7 coming into play again. So
I think that's a really interesting insight, and one I had not considered. When you talk about the voice coming 4 times at the destructions in 3rd Nephi, is it 3rd Nephi 11 at the very beginning, where the voice about, God introducing his son as he comes down after the destructions? That's 3 times, right? So you have 4 with the destructions, if that's correct. And I haven't looked, I'm assuming it is. But then 3 times in the segue for now the heavenly part with Jesus coming down.
So there's 5, it comes 5 times. So the first time it describes the destruction with the 4 elements. And then there's a space where they think about it and they mourn for the destruction. Then the voice comes again the 2nd time, and then there's another space, and then they hear the voice. Then it's 3 times. So it adds up to 5 times that the voice speaks, but it's only the 5th time that they understand that it's the Lord speaking.
Are you including in your number the introduction of Jesus in 3rd Nephi 11?
It just says a voice comes. So whether it's Father, Son, Holy Ghost, it just says a voice from heaven.
Okay. And who has their scriptures with them? Because I don't. I'm embarrassed to say I could run over there and get them, but then you'd see what I'm wearing.
So I just wanted to mention that's all really brilliant, Nolan. I like that a lot. And on the Urim and Thummim, the interpreters, I don't know if you've gotten my book yet, but if you haven't, then this part about Mosiah would be relevant there.
I've got it, Don. I just haven't read it yet. I apologize.
Oh, you're totally good.
We're talking about the lost 116
Lost
pages.
yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
So if I could ask Nolan, because you kept hitting the point that the fifth element, and you reference ether. You're speaking now in terms of alchemy. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so this is the quintessence. And so the fifth element or quintessence is actually three combined into one. So in Christian terms, it requires the Trinity to complete or reach the quintessence. Is that
Yes.
kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, sir.
So Nolan has been doing a lot of research on this. I'm looking forward to this bearing a lot of fruit. He was kind enough to allow me to read a paper that he was writing. And I know you've been doing further research and working with the historian. Have you been developing this line of research with that historian?
And we've talked about it a lot. We were going to do more alchemy type stuff in the Sunstone presentation, but we had a hard time narrowing down what to talk about. So, and I'm in graduate school right now, and I've been super busy, but I do want to work on it more.
Well, you'll have to come share it here as it develops. We'd love to have you come speak on it to us. That would be fantastic.
Who is it you're working with, Nolan?
I worked throughout the summer with L. Ray Henriksen of the Community of Christ. He has a Book of Mormon study group, and there's some really interesting stuff in that group going on.
Cool. Wow.
I think it's fascinating. Thank you for throwing that in there, Nolan. I think there's a lot of things going on, the vast majority of which I am totally unaware of. It's like the old Sam Cooke song, "Don't know much about alchemy." That's me. And I need a laugh track or something. I need a laugh track just so I know if these are landing or if they're really just going off the end of the aircraft carrier like they all seem to be. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Hey,
yeah, and the only thing
can
I know
I ask
about
you a question, RFM?
Yes.
Sorry.
The only thing I know about quintessence is where it shows up in Hamlet, right? Where Hamlet's talking about what work is man, and he ends up with this quintessence of dust.
Yeah.
That's all I know. I didn't even know what it was until you mentioned what it really is, Nolan.
All I know is to pee or not to pee. That is the question.
This late in the presentation, you better figure that out.
I'm hoping he chose the latter.
So
but I can't tell from
anyway,
here. Go ahead. Yes.
And this is also aimed at Don as well. My recollection when I first heard that you guys were working on this research, at the time there was actually a discussion of the number 8, and I don't know whether that was Don or you or who was, but the number 8 also seems to be maybe less so than 7, but possibly a symbolic and important number. It shows up in the Bible, I think in one of the epistles of Peter. It's related somehow to the ark. Anyhow, my
the world was
recollection is
baptized
that
by water, in which what few, that is 8 souls, were saved.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Wow. Impressive. Your memory really impresses me. So either you or Don, were you working on 8, or am I misremembering?
I'm waiting for Don to respond. I don't know.
Yeah,
Don, did you have anything you wanted to say?
I had
a comment, but I want to hear from Don first.
Okay, sorry. I didn't realize I was muted. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that I was working on 8 as such, but I found some things that dealt with 8 and dealt with 8 in connection with 7, right? So the story of the Mulekites. So Emer Harris, who was a brother of Martin Harris and ancestor of Dallin Harris Oakes. He gave a talk on April 6th, 1856 at the Provo Tabernacle, where he'd been asked to speak, like commemorating the founding of the church. And he said a little bit about what was in the lost pages of the Book of Mormon. And it was just a little snippet, but it's something that we don't have in the extant Book of Mormon text. And he says that there were that in Mulek's group, there were 4 members of their sort of royal household or extended royal family who, like 4 males who escaped the destruction, right, from the King of Babylon, and then 4 females, and so 8 together, right, 4 pairs, and they traveled to the New World, and they were the founders of the Mulekite nation. So one of the things that I found, obviously that echoes Noah, right? But then one of the other things that interested me was they would have constituted an 8th tribe, right? If you add them to the Lehite 7 tribes. And yet, when I was looking at the monetary denominations in Alma 10, they're based on a sort of a system of doubling, right? So you have like 1 unit that's worth like 2 of another, and then you have a unit that's worth like 4 of that original unit. And so the next thing you'd expect would be 8, right? But actually the next one is 7. And so I was wondering if there was a deliberate avoidance there actually of 8. And you'll notice that while I refer to the Mulekites, the Book of Mormon never once uses that term. Like it always calls them the people of Zarahemla, which is a really preposterous thing to call them, because that would be like calling our country, you know, the people of Biden or something, right? Like just the most recent leader or sort of the latest leader rather than like the founding leader.
Yeah.
And so it seems like you would think they'd be an 8th tribe, and their sacred number is presumably 8. That's enshrined in their mythos, right? But then where you would expect 8 to pop up in the monetary system of the combined peoples of Nephi and Zarahemla or Mulek, you don't get 8, you get 7. And so that's one of they're also, the number 24, appears multiple places, especially in connection with the Jaredites. And the Jaredites have 8 barges, which is again, probably echoing Noah and sort of prefiguring the Mulekites. And then they have like
And didn't they have 16 shining stones?
They have 16 shining stones, which of course, is a multiple of 8. But then when you take the 8 barges and you combine them with the 16 stones, you get 24. And there are 24 Jaredite plates. So 24, of course, like the main thing I think of is it's doubling of 12, right?
Yeah.
But it's also 3 8s.
Yeah.
So yeah, something's going on there with the 8s.
Yeah. Thank you.
So
I really appreciate that.
I have like a little suggestion, because of just knowing like 8 is a departure from the natural world into the supernatural world, and 7 is, completeness or perfect number. So if you have the monetary system, for example, you don't want to depart from the natural world into the supernatural with the monetary system. You'd rather go with the 7, right? And then in the case of the Jaredite, stones and the Urim and Thummim and all that kind of stuff is more of a supernatural. So you'd want to go with the 8, right?
Well, the 8 is also the sacred Ogdoad of a lot of the ancient mystery cults too. And it does have more to do with the heavens than the earth, which is interesting because like RFM said, though, 4 is the earth. So you double 4 and then you get to heaven, but yet 3 is the heaven. So but then 7's the virgin number anciently too. So that was much stronger than the 8, but they're competing, man. This is competition mathematics.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with you, Carrie. And then I think that if you're looking at the text and you figure which number would be more appropriate for what we're talking about or what we want to point out in the text, then you would manipulate it to be that number.
Yeah.
If you're manipulating it, which I think you've done a really good job, RFM, in proving that it is being manipulated.
Thank you. And that's the main thrust of what I was trying to get at. I know that I think it's Nolan has his hand raised. I just want to add this comment, and this is not to detract from the excellent comments that have been made, and I don't want to be seen as constraining it in any way. But I think that there's also an element of how we count. In America, where I was born and raised, so I'm familiar with how we count. I become 1 year old after I've lived on this earth for 12 months. And then I have my first birthday. And then another 12 months, I have my second birthday. But actually, when I'm 1 year old, I'm entering into my second year, right? And so even sometimes like Joseph Smith talking about being in his 15th year, well, he's actually 14. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. That's sort of that imposition of that different counting system. I think that I didn't go to China on my mission, but I think the Chinese do it differently, that when you're born, you're 1 year old. So you're 1 year old for your entire first year, which makes its own kind of sense. And then when you have your first birthday, well, what I would think of as the first birthday, now that becomes the second birthday, right? So you're 2 for your entire second year. And my understanding, correct me if I have this wrong, because I really might, I'm stretching for this, but I think that the ancient Hebrews did it more similarly to the Chinese than we do. So then there's this question, how do you count? And there are some times when I think that maybe the 8 is what we would call a 7. But it almost sounds like I'm straining for effect, to try and cover bases and incorporate more. I believe that when I was researching this, that it wasn't part of the paper, that there are different places in the Old Testament where it's talking about we talked about the sabbatical years being every 7th year. It's the Jubilee, right? And a Jubilee is how many?
49.
50.
Thank you, because both of those answers are correct. At least both of those answers are reflected in the Old Testament. That some will say it's 50 years and others will say it's 49. And the question and the debate is, are they talking about different numbers or are they talking about the same number in different ways?
It's 49 because that's 7 squared, right?
Well, right. I mean, that is what the Jubilee is. It's the super sabbatical year. It's 7 times 7. But then again, do you get to 7 times 7? And then the year after that, the 50th year is the Jubilee year. So is it 50 or is it 49? And maybe it just depends on how you count it.
It's 42.
It's 42.
According to Douglas Adams.
There you go. That's funny.
I'm laughing and I don't get it, but I think it has something to do with hitchhikers and the galaxy. I'm so glad Carrie's muted, because otherwise he would blow my eardrums out with that laughter right now.
Can I throw something in? One thing I think I've read about this a while back. I think the base 6, which would include 12, I think potentially, which we see a lot of. I've heard, and we see 6 showing up sometimes in the Old Testament, 360. I don't know, something happened. I can't remember the details, but some have argued that that's a Babylonian influence because they did everything on base 6. And so the Hebrews, some people have argued, well, the Hebrews were in competition with the Babylonians. And so they went with 7 because the Babylonians went with 6, and today our clocks are they're Babylonian clocks. We have 60 minutes and all that jazz, So anyway, I throw out that maybe the 6 and the 12 might be a Babylonian influence during the period of captivity. But I wanted to say this is all very interesting. And so the question is, was Joseph Smith trying to do something? And was it coincidence or is there really something there? And that's hard to determine. But I got thinking, hey, if Joseph Smith is like putting numerology or whatever into his work, one really interesting place to look would be in his translation of Genesis. Is it chapter 6 where he does the genealogies, right, of the patriarchs? And he adds, he changes that sometimes. And by the way, that genealogy is full of numeric stuff, right? It's just loaded. Every age of every patriarch has got some numerological significance. Joseph Smith changes some of those, but he also adds the date that they got the priesthood, as I recall. And that would be interesting for somebody to look at the ages of priesthood, and is there something going on? Because you think he would do that if he had the chance right there. Anyway, that's my comment.
That's really fascinating, Claire. Good comment.
I agree. I'm sorry. Was it turned back to me or to the person who's conducting this?
Well, along those lines, I one of the most fascinating things about your presentation is this idea of number being manipulated and not matching the reality. So, so a 6 is turned into a 7, or a 13 is turned into a 14 in the Bible. And I'm wondering if there's a way in which it's possible that that this is supposed to reflect something about the nature of the book in almost a magical sense, that there's the idea, for example, that Joseph Smith promulgates, that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on earth. And that almost seems, like a contradiction if it's filled with these mistakes, but these mistakes are actually deliberate additions, numerical additions that raise relatively insignificant numbers to being really potent and symbolic numbers. And it almost feels like, and I'm really building on not only what you're thinking about here, RFM, but what Nolan was bringing to the table, that in manipulating the numbers in this way, in reference to reality, that there's almost a kind of alchemical process that's taking place in the text itself. And that, it's not just what the text says that seems alchemical, but it's actually the process whereby the factual reality is somehow transmuted and turned into something more symbolic and potent, such as, the Book of Mormon isn't just a bunch of plates, they're golden plates, and they're delivered by an angel. I mean, there's this real effort to make every aspect of the text seem incredibly divinely significant. I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but I'd be interested in anyone's reaction to that idea.
May I just add something? That is an interesting idea. However, from my take on it, you mentioned mistake. I mean, yeah, it can look like a mistake if it's a deliberate manipulation, though. Can we call it a mistake rather than an intention? And and I know, here we go, hang on to your seatbelts, we're going down the rabbit hole. Does the spiritual world have to match this material world that we call reality? Because truly, reality is based on our human size. For instance, hard and soft. We say something is hard or soft based on our skin, long or short based on our body, right? So, I mean, I'm not trying to, I'm just saying, if we were at the atomic level, it's all the same, truly.
Well, I would say that it's maybe apparent
it,
mistakes, that apparent mistakes are deliberately placed there to draw our attention to what's being done.
Because symbolically there's more meaning to the spiritual sense than the material reality.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm just brainstorming.
Yeah, no, thank you, Carrie. That's magnificent. I think Don wanted to pipe in.
So yeah, so I mean, I actually was going to ask a question, but it sounds like is what you were really getting at, Trevor, which is, I mean, raising this question both because I'm interested in what people already think, but also raising it as a question for that I think needs to be explored, needs to be taken into account in understanding the book, right? And that is, so maybe, you know, particularly RFM for you, but then also for anyone. So why would there be any mismatch at all in the book if the author is creating the story for themselves, right? So sure, if I'm trying to align a literal real world incident, right, with a desired number, then I may have to do manipulation. But if I'm creating the story, I could just create it to be 7 cities to start with and not have to bother with having having to force a mismatch in there, you know. So yeah, and it sounds like, Trevor, that's kind of what you're getting at as well, but I'd be interested in thoughts.
Well, talking about the Noah story, I went back and I looked at it because I was thinking 600. I think this is something that Claire had brought up. And yeah, the text says that the waters finally abated. We all know it was 40 days and 40 nights, and apparently it took 150 days for the waters to go down. But it says that the waters finally abated on the first day of the 601st year. So there was a full completion of 600 years, apparently from the beginning. I don't know if that's from probably the fall, but it says the 601st year, first day of the first month. So that shows up there, and maybe that Babylonian influence you're talking about. It does strike me what Trevor's talking about, though, is that, I mean, what would be more natural than when you're translating from a certain point of view, this alchemy idea? I don't know much about alchemy, but I know that the plates were represented as being gold. And so is it possible, this is just a question, is it possible that Joseph Smith is using literary techniques and alchemical combinations in order to literarily create the gold plates from which he translated the Book of Mormon in the first place?
So also,
sorry.
Nice, I like that.
Oh, Trevor, I was just going to say that also, the way that, because according to Don's question, like if you're making up the story, why do you have to, why can't you just make it the number you want anyway? So I think that what you were saying, Trevor, about calling attention through the mistake, I think there's something in chiasmus. I haven't studied that in so long, but like it's something like they take a certain 2 lines and like switch them around. Do you know what I'm talking about? So if one is supposed to be like line 13 and one is line 14, they take 13 and make it 14, and then they switch those 2 lines around, and it's just to kind of call attention to the, so everything else in the chiasmus is perfect, but then you have these 2 lines that are switched, and they're always the same ones. And so that just calls attention to those 2 lines. Has anyone heard that?
No, that is fascinating.
I have heard that before. I have heard that before, Cheryl, and I think I researched it, by which I mean I asked somebody who knows more about it than I do. And I think that the person I asked said they looked at it and they said, really, they had heard this idea of there's the certain two lines that are changed,
Mhm.
but they didn't find that. They thought that was more of a rumor than anything else. And I don't know, but I have heard of that idea before. That's just my experience with my research and what it was that this other person told me. I do know that I always have to caution myself against that type of interpretation, because if it's true, it's true. But if it's not, it seems like a very attractive way of explaining a discrepancy in what would
Yeah.
otherwise be a perfect chiasmic structure.
Yeah, but I was just trying to kind of answer Don's question to the fact that, rather than just using the number that you need, you might use this as a technique for calling even more attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, Cheryl, can I mention something about that chiasmus and 2 Nephi 4:11
Mhm.
that I didn't mention before? So this is an odd number, which means there's one line that is emphasized. It's the E line, the fifth line.
Right.
Where it says, blessed art thou and thy seed. This is Lehi's blessing to Sam, remember. For thou shalt inherit the land like unto thy brother Nephi, and thy seed shall be numbered. That's the emphasis, with his seed. And then it goes back the other way. You know what the really crazy thing is? Do you know what Sam means in Egyptian?
It must be number.
It,
What?
it means united or uniter.
Okay.
Oh, weird.
Yes, and Hugh Nibley had pointed this out, talking about Sam Towie.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait.
You
Sam,
tell me to buckle my seatbelt, pal. You buckle yours, because it's going to be a bumpy night.
I'm flying up. No,
United.
wait. No, I've heard something too with Sam.
It means united or uniter. It has this element of uniting. And
and Nibley's using the Egyptian, the Sam Tawi.
yes.
Yeah, but
The
you
uniter
can't.
of the yes, but apparently it's correct, because this survived peer review, baby.
Well, wait a minute though. Sam Tawi is not Sam. It's Sam Tawi. You can't ignore the Tawi.
The Tawi is the two lands. The Sam is the uniter.
Interesting.
Upper and lower.
Well, I've heard Sam is also Shem, which is kind of like the Hebrew name too. So it depends on whether it's reformed Egyptian or reformed Hebrew. Yeah.
Here's the funny thing. If it's Egyptian, which is kind of what the Book of Mormon would lead us to expect, or not be a shock. It's not Assyrian, right?
Sure.
Or Sumerian or something like that. But it sounds very American, Sam. But it ends up being an Egyptian word that has been used in the name Sam Tawi, uniter. We know virtually nothing about Sam in the Book of Mormon. The only thing really that we know about Sam is in this one verse. And it's a chiasmus. And what we find out is that the focal point of the chiasmus is that Sam's seed shall be numbered with Nephi's seed, which it isn't a huge stretch to see that Sam's seed shall be united with Nephi's seed. And if so, there's potentially a play on words going on here with an obviously intentional chiastic structure, putting as the focal point numbered in relation to Sam's seed.
And they share the same number. If they're the same tribe, they occupy the same number. Sorry.
By that you mean they're united into one.
Yeah.
One tribe, yes.
But if
from
you
8
were
to
to
7.
count them, you would count them together and they would be one number in a series.
Yes, but there's still two parts to the chiasmus.
2 parts?
Yeah, the upper and lower.
Right. And
it's 2 in 1. Yeah.
Yeah.
Duality to unity. I'm convinced. I'm going to church Sunday.
Well, I probably won't see you there.
So, okay. Getting back to, and this is just a further anecdotal kind of evidence coming from another culture, and one that I know very little about. But as a young man recently graduated from BYU, I visited Istanbul and went to the Grand Bazaar, and several times I was given the same little presentation by the person running the shop, who would show me some beautiful piece of workmanship. They would look at this decorated box, or a beautiful Persian rug, and they would point to this and they say, oh, here's an imperfection. And they must have done this because they were accustomed to dealing with Americans who would buy something, notice that it had an imperfection, and that person would promptly bring back whatever it is and complain about it. You sold me this thing and it's actually imperfect, it's flawed. But they would say, no, this is imperfect deliberately because only God makes something that's perfect. And I thought, well, that's a very interesting idea, that if in attempting to create something perfect, if you aim at perfection, one might think of it almost as an act of sacrilege, that you were attempting to emulate deity. But you could also turn that around and imagine that you're playing with this boundary between imperfection and perfection, and highlighting that boundary in showing on the one hand the mundane and its limitations, its actual numbers, the facticity of it, as opposed to the perfection of the symbolic or geometric or alchemical. And that might be what's happening in the manipulation of number this way. I'm sorry that I've become so obsessed with this, but it seems to me that you've really landed on something very significant here. I find it interesting that it exists in the Bible, but what really interests me is how, and I'm approaching this from a certain perspective, how Joseph Smith, either through inspiration, the Nephites, or just Joseph Smith as an author, if one takes that viewpoint, how is it that the Book of Mormon is responding to this tradition, and is it doing something different, more deliberate, something that, as like Nolan is digging into, and I know others, not just Nolan, but Nolan's a convenient example, he's talked about it here, that Nolan was talking about this alchemical tradition and what it's brought to the table. I would love to see a lot more work done on this, because it seems to me to be pregnant with possibilities for a deeper understanding of what's going on with the Book of Mormon. And just to go on a bit further, I think this is one of the reasons why I am so adamant about doing this kind of exercise, having these discussions. And I thank you, RFM, for bringing this topic to us, because it's easy, I think, to underestimate the Book of Mormon. And if people both within the LDS tradition, the larger restoration tradition, and outside of it, including former LDS people or former restoration members, there's a tendency to say, oh, well, the Book of Mormon, blah. And there are many ways that you can underestimate what's going on with the Book of Mormon, whether it's just the simple idea that this was, translated by the gift and power of God. If you just reduce your understanding of what's going on to the Book of Mormon to that kind of pat description or explanation. But on the other hand, to say, oh, well, Joseph Smith just wrote that, it's not significant. What we're doing here, what I hope people see, is that regardless of how you feel personally about the text and what you choose to see it as in your life, is it spiritually significant or not, it is an object that is worthy of study. That there's quite a lot going on here. You've illustrated that to me yet again tonight, RFM, and I want to thank you for that. Are there any other questions or
May I
comments
make a
that-
quick comment
Yeah,
that dovetails with your idea?
Yeah, thank you.
The way you put this reminded me of the Navajo sand paintings. They deliberately, now they're so good that they can make a perfect painting, but they always refuse to do so. And they say because that will tap into the supernatural. Now, true, I get it. I understand. I'm completely with every one of you that says that's just superstitious nonsense. Not to them. So they are deliberate, and they are the Lamanites, according to Spencer W. Kimball. We've got their DNA now. So with their sand paintings, deliberately building a manipulation, I'll put it, to either make them imperfect or they leave out a specific part or whatever. Perhaps this idea of manipulating reality into a more perfect symbolic reality to what symbolize the spiritual higher plane, so to speak, than the mundane physical plane, something to that effect. But imperfection, manipulation of art with religious meaning, you know, we have this book chock full of religious meaning. Maybe that, you know, our scientific based culture today just simply throws the skepticism into it and says, like you're noting, right? But maybe there's more to it. Who knows? I agree, though. Thanks, RFM. This, you always bring something excellent to the table. I'm not supposed to tell you that. It'll swell your fat head, but I love how you just present everything you present. So it's
Well, thank
very
you.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Praise from Caesar. And seriously, I think that there's a window here. I think there's a window in the wall. I'm not exactly sure what it gives us a view on, but I think it gives us a view on something. And maybe we got a window here we can look through. By the way, there was one other thing. Can I just add this? Because I think this is fascinating. This is something that Brant Gardner discovered, and I didn't know about till I was researching for the paper. But this is another pattern of 3 groups of 7 in the Book of Mormon. It's in 4th Nephi. And this is what he says about it. By the way, it's the 7 years are gaps in the text. So I'll just read what he wrote. This repeating, okay, Brant Gardner has noted a 3-fold repetition of a 7-year gap of time in 4th Nephi verses 6 and 14. This is what he says. This repeating pattern occurs 3 times in 4th Nephi and never anywhere else in the Book of Mormon. The triple repetition confirms that it is not random information and not associated with Mormon's source. Mormon is telling us something. He has moved from real time into symbolic time, or from history into story. The repetition of 7-year gaps, and he gives the verses, which are 42 to 49, 52 to 59, and 72 to 79. By the way, those aren't the verses. Those are the 7-year gaps that are reflected in the text. My mistake. The repetition of 7-year gaps suggests that he is deliberately using the spacing symbolically, likely to mark a week of years. And actually, I'm not sure what he means by that week of years part. I apologize. It's been too long. But he definitely does show that the Book of Mormon text in 4th Nephi verses 6 through 14 does give us 3 7-year gaps in the way that it is recorded. And I think that if I think if I looked it up here, I could make it even more clear as to the way it is recorded.
Now,
I'm
isn't
sorry,
it
I
the
know we're
case
staying up late,
that-
especially on the East Coast. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Is it? At least it's fine for me. Isn't it the case so that 4th Nephi is one of the least narratively interesting books in the Book of Mormon? So that is very interesting, because you're talking about a book that doesn't have much narrative, and what's highlighted here are 7-year gaps.
Yes.
Now, in normal time, you know, in our 7-day week, or the seventh is the gap in a series of 7. It's the Shabbat, or right, it's the stopping point, it's the pause. But here now the whole 7 has become the pause in time. Is that, do you see what I'm saying? It's almost a strange inversion of, but it's doing this in a book that's almost completely bereft of narrative. And the reason why that is because they've sort of realized here, and I think really for the first time in a Western, in a Western Christian epic, and I'm sorry, but I'm dealing with this sort of as a secular literary scholar would. I think of the Book of Mormon as falling within the tradition of Christian epics, like Jerusalem Liberated, the Luciads, and so forth. And but one thing that sets the Book of Mormon apart is that, you know, you do reach this realization of a Christian utopia. And then at that point, instead of seeing all of these wonderful descriptions of what's happening in this Christian utopia, instead it's the fact that nothing's happening.
Right.
Because as Nibley once said, history is only a cataloging of all the bad things that are happening. Here, when good things are happening, there's nothing to write about. So it's interesting that I had never noticed this. That's a fascinating observation or discovery that Brant made, and I hadn't even known about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. What it's chronicling the first 100 years, because everybody's getting along, so there's nothing to write about except how great it was, and you can't write too much about that. But this is how it's reflected in the text, just so you know. It's verse 6 that covers the first 2 times, and verse 14 covers the 3rd time. But verse 6 says, "And thus did the 38th year pass away, and also the 39th, and 41st, and the 42nd." So it goes up to the 42nd, right? It does skip 40, it appears, but it goes up to the 42nd, and then it says, "Yea, even until 49 years had passed away." So there's that 7-year gap between the 42nd year and the 49 years had passed away. And then it goes on in the same verse and does the exact same thing with the next decade, and also the 51st and the 52nd. Yea, and even until 59 years had passed away. So there's your second 7-year gap, and they get the third one, which apparently, according to Brant Gardner, and he does know his Book of Mormon, doesn't occur anywhere else in the Book of Mormon. In verse 14, you get the third one. And it came to pass that the 71st year passed away, and also the 72nd year, yea, and in fine, till the 79th year had passed away.
Now, I'd notice also that in that list, the Jubilee is mentioned. I mean, in that you see an appearance of the number 49.
Good point. Yes.
So I'm wondering if this figures into the scheme in any way. I mean, it doesn't look at first, but it's just the fact that this particular point, the year 49, has a kind of marked reference there in the series, as does, for some reason, 59 and 79.
Yes. And guess what? In that verse 6, it's in the 3rd decade, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the 4th decade.
Yeah.
This is just coming to me as we're talking, because 3 + 4 = 7.
Yeah, yeah.
And it is frequently found that way, that the 7 is constituted. This is other stuff that I did, which I didn't cover tonight. These 7s frequently come up in 2 groups, and one of them is 3 and one of them is 4. You put them together, you get the 7. But here's 3 and 4. It's the 3rd decade and the 4th decade in which those are embedded. Verse 14 is, oh shit, I'm sorry. Guess what verse 14 is, Professor?
What?
It's the 7th decade.
Oh, wow.
Brant Gardner didn't see that.
No, he didn't.
Oh my gosh. Wow, that does look kind of intentional.
But
doubly
the
intentional.
versification, though, that's a later.
Orson Pratt.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
Orson Pratt is the one who probably deliberately did that.
That's why it was hidden. Yeah, that character.
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, what does it mean when you say the versification?
The breaking it up into verses.
Yes.
Yeah, that was Orson Pratt's
He
doing.
means
The
fact that
original
it's the number
has no
14?
verses.
Is that what you're
Yes.
saying about the verse, Trevor?
I think RFM was saying that verse 14 has a reference to the number 7 in it.
Yes. So I wasn't actually referring to the verse number.
Oh,
And that's what I was wondering if that's what you're talking about, because
Oh,
yes, that
okay.
would be a random thing. But I'm just giving this for description of where it's found.
Okay.
In verse, this happens 3 times, and I'm sorry, but you're hearing this first, maybe in the world tonight, in this company. This happens 3 times with the 7-year gaps, right? It happens with the 3rd and the 4th decade. Okay, let me read this again. And this is verse 6, which puts those two together. And thus did the 30 and 8th year pass away. It's a 3rd decade, right? And also
Yeah.
the 30 and 9th and 40 and 1st. Oh, wait, and the 40 and 2nd, you even until 40. Okay, forget about it. You didn't hear it here first, because it's the 4th decade and the 5th decade.
Oh.
Shoot, we should rewrite the Book of Mormon. And
I-
but that's
I'm
the
gonna
4th decade.
I'm
Go
going to
ahead.
complain to the angels. This was getting good.
Well,
It was, and that's the
No,
unfortunate
it's-
thing when you
it
think you're
still
seeing
is.
something and then you find out you're not, and you go, crap.
well,
but
but
this
it
is-
depends on how you think of it, because it's the 30s and the 40s.
It does start with the 30th. So it does say the 30 and 8th year passed away, and also the 30 and 9th and 40 and 1st and the 40 and 2nd, yea, even until 40 and 9 years had passed away. So that first 7-year gap is in the 4th decade.
Okay, but how many numbers are in that series?
Okay, can you explain what you mean by
No,
how many
no.
numbers?
Starting with the first reference to 30, the first number, then going to 49. How many numbers are mentioned in that series?
I think 5. And thus did the 30 and 8th year pass away, and also the 30 and 9th, and 40 and 1st, and the 40 and 2nd, yea, even until 40 and 9 years had passed away.
Yeah, 5. I'm sorry, just as you know, Nolan was bringing our attention to the number 5. There are 5 in that series.
In the next series, in the 5th decade, it will use 3. If that means anything, I'm just
Well, that
counting
now
right
we're at
now.
8.
And also the 50 and 1st and the 50 and 2nd, yea, even until 50 and 9 years had passed away. So the first one makes a point of using 5. The second one for the 5th decade uses 3. And by the way, there may be something intentional going on. I don't know. But once again, I have to note that they do skip a year. Okay? Because what I would expect is if everybody has verse 6 of 4th Nephi in front of you, this will make a lot more sense. And thus did the 30 and 8th year pass away, and also the 30 and 9th. And what would you expect would be next? The 40th, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But it doesn't. It goes to the 40 and 1st.
yeah.
I wanted the 30 and 10th.
So I don't know if something's going on there, but there is a skipping of that year. And then we get down to verse 14. That's definitely the 7th decade. I can give you that much, right?
Yeah.
Came to pass the 70 and 1st year passed away, and also the 70 and 2nd year. Yea, and fine until the 70 and 9th year had passed away. So they do another threesome with that. Don't even say it, Carrie, okay? They do another group of 3 with those years. And then, yea, even 100 years had passed away.
And so what's the total number of numbers in the whole series from 30 all the way through 100? And by the way, what's the difference between 30 and 100?
70.
70.
Okay, so it would be 5, 3,
3.
and 4 if you include the 100, but 3 if you don't include it.
I
Yeah.
don't have it in front of me, but it's like, it doesn't seem like each one of those is 7 to me, right? It's
Oh,
Am I
okay. Is
adding
that
wrong?
Cheryl? Is that Cheryl?
Yes,
So here
yes.
we go in this is how Brent Gardner did. I think he got it
Wait,
right.
it's
Let's see.
it's 4th Nephi chapter 6.
Verse 6, yes.
4th Nephi chapter 6, verse 6.
There's only one chapter in 4th Nephi.
Oh,
It's not even
4th
really called a
Nephi.
chapter technically
4th Nephi verse. Okay.
because it's so short.
Okay.
So in verse 6, and thus did the 30 and 8th year pass away, and also the 30 and 9th and 40 and 1st, and it goes up to the 40 and 2nd, right? And then it says, yea, and here comes the 7-year gap.
Oh.
Yea, even
Oh.
until 40 and 9 years had passed away. That's the 7-year gap that started this.
Okay.
And then the second,
42 to 49.
and then the second one is right after it, and also the 50 and 1st and the 50 and 2nd, yea, and even until 50 and 9 years had passed away. So there's the
Okay.
second 7-year gap, and then the third 7-year gap And then it actually goes and talks about other things other than years. And
Yeah.
it returns to it in verse 14, where you get your third 7-year gap, where it says, and it came to
Okay.
pass.
I
the
see it now. Okay,
Okay.
sorry.
And then it goes right into, yea, even 100 years had passed away. So it's going to skip from the 79th year to the 100th year, because apparently we don't have to do this with every
But guess
decade
what?
to make the point.
What's the difference
that-
between 79 and 100?
And that's 21, which
21,
is 3
which is 3 sevens. Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's
got
true.
that too, Trevor.
Yeah.
Fun stuff. After
And
Oh
it's-
my gosh.
And it segues right into another 3, right? But not years, disciples. And the
Yeah.
disciples of Jesus, whom he had chosen, had all gone to the paradise of God, save it were the 3 who should tarry.
Yeah, the 3 sevens. You might call them 3 sevens too. I don't know. Because they're translated, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. The translated, so they've achieved that divine state thereby earning the number 7, or at least having it appropriately applied to each
Yeah,
one
well,
individually.
if they were actually taken up, they would become 8s. But since they're still on Earth and they've only been translated, now they're just 7s. But if they were really hot, then they'd be 10s.
And then it says when 210.
It took me a
Very
second to
good.
get that one.
Then when it says when 210 years have passed away, which 2 and 1 equals 3. There's your 3.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, where's that, Cheryl?
Let me go back.
Verse 18?
It's verse 27.
Yeah, 210 years had passed. So that's certainly 21 times 10. I will note that it does the same thing with, well, it does mention 200 years passing away in verse 22. And it also mentions, does it mention 110 years? I thought I saw that at one point. Let me see here. I know we shouldn't be doing research live. That's probably
I
not
know,
the
but
most.
this is too
Oh
good.
no, this is what Sunday
It's
school
fun.
should have been.
Yeah,
It-
Sunday school.
And verse 18 has 110 years for the Lord to bless them, because it mentions, right, for the Lord to bless them in all their doing, even they were blessed and prospered until 110 years had passed away. And the first generation from Christ had passed away.
Oh, wow.
The 3rd generation.
You know what
Interesting.
110 years is, though? I mean, this is a completely different system, but for the Romans, some of them calculated what was called a cyclum, which was a religiously significant period of time in Roman thought.
Why did they choose 110, Trevor? Do you
That's
know?
a good question. I don't know that we know. But
You know,
the
this is really the thing that's really interesting about all this is that there's so many numbers in this chapter. And so I think that that's very significant. And somebody does need to go through and look at all the numbers.
Yep.
And like in numerology, where you go, like if you have 184 and you add the 1 and the 8 and the 4 together, you know, that's, and then, so that's what, 12. And then you add the 2 and the 1 together, it's 3. So anyway, I think somebody needs to go through all that, the numbers in this, and see if they're significant.
Okay, you
because-
do that and present your research after mine.
Okay, it sounds
what-
good though. I mean, because obviously with all these numbers, there's something going on, you know?
So 110 was the age that Joseph of Egypt was when he died.
Oh, wow.
And there's an echo, I think, of that here, because when it talks about when he died, right, like the Egyptians still, there was like peace and prosperity for the Hebrews with the Egyptians at that point, but it wasn't until there was like a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, right, there was a problem. And then like, so when I was talking in the Book of Mormon about like they prospered until 110 years had passed away, and the first generation from Christ passed away. I think it's alluding back to that.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's really nice. That's nice done.
So
Wow.
another thing that's going on with the numbers. So this is in my book too. So this, you know, this series of numbers in 4th Nephi ends with 320, right? Which is not a it's not a multiple of 7, right?
Mhm.
But the phrasing that's used there where this number appears is just sort of like standard Book of Mormon phrasing for talking about years, but it says in verse 48, and it came to pass that when 320 years had passed away, Amaron, being constrained by the Holy Ghost, had hide up the records, right? So the people are getting more wicked, right? And then 320 years had passed away, and you have Amaron, right, hiding up the records. Well, in the book of Omni, right, Omni 1, verse 5, behold, it came to pass that 320 years had passed away. So that's, that's the exact same phrase and number, right? And the more wicked part of the Nephites were destroyed. And the person who's making this record, he just gave his name in the previous verse. And now I, Amaron, write the things whatsoever I write, which are few in the book of my father.
Wow.
And so at the point of 320 years after Lehi and 320 years after the birth of Christ, in both cases, you have the people are becoming wicked, and you've got a record keeper named Amaron. So there's some deliberate parallel there. And part of what I think is going on is that I actually think that fourth Nephi in some ways is echoing the lost years of the Book of Mormon, right? The years that were covered in the lost pages. And so there was a significant event of destruction in the year 320, right? And this is then being echoed. And based on, we don't have an exact number for this, but based on what I've been able to piece together, it appears that the initial destruction in the lost pages of Nephites, right? Not the final destruction, but their destruction of their initial nation in the land of Nephi, so the original Nephite nation. That apparently happened in the year 400. That's when Mosiah the First leads them as their Moses figure, right, out of the land and up to Zarahemla. So I think that the original, and then when you look in the, toward the end of the Book of Mormon, it's at the year 400 when Mormon says that the Nephites have all been wiped out.
Wow.
And so what's happening is you've got the same structure of events, right? You have a smaller event at the year 320, right, as people are becoming wicked, but then you have like the big destruction of the nation at the year 400. The difference the second time is there's no Mosiah. There's nobody to save them from themselves. So they completely implode instead of a righteous remnant being let out somewhere else.
So how do we relate this to 1820?
Oh,
Don, is this all in your book?
Because 1, 8, and 2 is 11. That's prime.
I don't remember how much I dealt with the correlation of the 400s. I might have dealt with it there, but I definitely have the 320s.
The Amaron, do you have that?
Yeah. So that's
so cool.
So the hardest part of the Book of Mormon's lost narrative to reconstruct is the part that's covered by Jacob, Enos, Jerem, and Omni, where it gives such a tiny thumbnail sketch in our extant text. So you have to really torture the pieces of evidence that are there to get them to talk. And this is one of the few things.
Yeah, and if I could throw in there, Don, something we had talked about many years ago, but it didn't quite work out well enough, or it didn't make enough sense to include in the paper, but that 400 years after Jesus, I think that that's important in the sense of Lehi's 600-year prophecy, because he talks, it's Lehi, I think, maybe it's Nephi, who the heck knows, but
It's
about
Lehi. Yeah.
Okay, 600 years until Jesus comes from the time we left Jerusalem. Well, we look at actual history and we realize, wait a second, they didn't leave Jerusalem in 600 BCE. They left it on the eve of the Babylonian captivity, which is probably around 587. And so a lot of times, okay. And what was the exact date? I want to know. No, seriously, seriously. December 14th on a night just like tonight.
6 a.m.
Okay. But people look at that and they say, well, obviously the Book of Mormon is wrong because they're talking about 600 years when it was like 600 minus 13. It is possible that standing alone looks odd. But when you look at the other half of the 400 years after Jesus, that maybe they were envisioning the entire chronology of the Nephites as being 1,000 years.
Mhm.
And that's why the 600 years before. I think, Don, that we looked at that and we couldn't make it fit because, sorry, this is going off the top of my head, that the 400 years, I mean, the 600 years counts from when they leave Jerusalem down to Jesus getting born, right? But the 400 years is counted not from when Jesus was born, but from when he visited them.
No, it's counted from when he's born.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a much better idea. I'm surprised that it wasn't
So it
included.
does, yeah, it does add up to 1,000. Yeah.
But it's not a 7. That's why. This is 1,000 thing. So it's possible that once again, we have another example of superimposing this religiously significant or symbolically significant of 1,000 years
Yeah.
onto an actual history, which is
Right.
maybe start 587 or 586, if Carrie's correct about the Babylonian captivity, BCE to, well, I think maybe, what is it,
421?
421 or 300 something?
Yeah, no, it's 421 or something.
421. I think
Maybe
so,
it's 421 when he finally gets around to burying the plates, though. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
And we know
Yeah.
that there's a long time. There had to be a long time between the destruction of the Nephites and Moroni burying the plates, because he had to make that very difficult trip from Mesoamerica all the way up to New York via Manti.
And you
He
know how
did-
it is getting across the border, right?
Yes, he probably got detained for years.
If you guys knew your stuff, you would realize he only had to go 3 miles to the Mesoamerican hill, Cumorah.
And then that got teleported to New York. The entire hill is what actually happened.
See, when you're stumped, ask RFM and Don. I'm telling you.
I know
So
it is interesting.
interestingly, yeah, and since Moroni buries the plates in 421, I'd never thought about any possible significance of the year. But and this
7.
is a little hokey in a way because the total isn't divisible by 7, but like it's adding, it's
Yep,
taking
421.
400
4
and it's
plus 2
adding
plus 1.
three sevens to it, which we've
Oh,
already seen
yeah.
3 sevens being significant.
That's great. Yeah, it's 4 plus 2 plus 1. It's 4 plus 3 sevens. It's
Oh.
yeah, 421. That's great.
That's how the Jews did one set of gematria. There are other ways, but that is one way they did it all right. So that's kind of interesting. I'd like to
Yeah.
get the Hebrew Book of Mormon and do some gematria in the Hebrew Book of Mormon. I actually saw a copy of it. It wasn't the whole Book of Mormon that was translated.
No, it wasn't.
Hannah didn't get the whole book. He got mostly 1st and 2nd Nephi, which
Hmm.
would be the good juicy ones anyway, with that tree of life Lehi dream. Ooh,
Yeah,
baby.
yeah,
And compare the gematria with Nephi's. I bet you I can find some 7s in there.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I will tell you that what Don mentioned just, of course, reminded me of Stephen King, because most things remind me either of Stephen King, Jaws, or Ghostbusters.
Or Shakespeare.
Oh, that's right. There is Shakespeare, the quintessence of dust. Yeah, Stephen King wrote a book. It was made into a movie with who was it? It was Samuel Jackson and it'll come to me.
Tim.
John. He's got a sister who's an actor. Cusack.
Oh, John Cusack. Yeah.
Yeah, John
okay,
Cusack.
Yeah.
And the name of the name is 1408 because it's
Yep.
after this motel room, right?
Yep.
That is haunted. Nobody can stay in it all night without dying or killing themselves. And so John Cusack is the guy who's going to stay in it. Anyway, the whole thing is just a gimmick because the room 1408 was created by Stephen King because you add them up and you get 13.
Yeah.
And that's what Don was saying about 421 adding up to be 7 reminded me of.
Right. Yeah.
It does happen.
It
That
does.
does happen.
It
Yeah.
does.
It can happen coincidentally. It can happen by design.
Yes. I think here it's by design. I'm just gonna guess. I'm gonna just throw it out there that 4th Nephi is a cornucopia of numerological delights.
Yeah, and I think the anchor to that supposition is those 3 groups of gaps of 7.
Well, that's where we begin to, that's thanks to Brant Gardner, but I think so much has been said here. My gosh, we're going to have a multi-authored article.
So
And
if
I think
somebody
the-
writes this article, can we call it a cornucopia of numerological delights?
Only
I like
if
that
we
phrase, Trevor.
only if we submit it to the interpreter.
They'll publish anything, so we're in.
The living room isn't available right now.
You know, I still have a paper under consideration at the interpreter.
And it will be for all time.
It will. They wanted to publish it. They wanted to publish it, but they said I had to do some more research in order to show that I had sufficiently interacted with the scholarly stuff that's already been published on it. And I thought, screw that. I had enough of that. In this paper, by the way, Don and I came up with, fleshed out this idea. And we have the idea, and it's demonstrable, I think, in the text.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the editor wanted me to go back and do the research about the numbers, their significance, what they mean. In other words, do all the background stuff that most people, I guess, would do in the first place. Maybe it doesn't happen that way. And I had to go to the local library and spend the day there just looking at books on numerology and coming up with stuff that everybody already knew, you know, and that didn't increase the value of the subject or what we were talking about, anything at all. It just made it look more scholarly because then you had more footnotes, and I resented it. And so when the interpreter comes back to me, this is with Jeff Lindsay, comes back to me and says, hey, love your idea. Could you do some more, precatory crap on this so that you can show that you're interacting with the other scholarly stuff that's already been written about it when it doesn't contribute at all to the point that I'm making, that I'm demonstrating in this absolutely fantastic paper that they want to publish. I just said, nah, no thanks. I'm not interested.
Well, now you know the hell that is the academic life, because it's always, you always have reviewers who come back who say, oh, well, you didn't cite X. And so then you have to go back to the library and check out these books. They want you to fill it all in. And that's
yes.
True, but who would want to publish with the interpreter? Why are you guys trying to publish with the interpreter? I don't get it.
Because it's an inside joke and a diabolical scheme. It is absolutely diabolical. And I was surprised that like 3 or 4 months later, Jeff Lindsay comes back to me and says, hey, have you gotten a chance to do that research? Actually, I don't think I really responded the first time. I just sort of put him off saying, yeah, I'm kind of busy right now. I'll see. And I didn't give it a second thought, except they weren't going to publish it. 3 or 4 months later, comes back. Have you gotten a chance to do that research? Because, they're on this crushing publication schedule.
They are. Every week. Week.
Every Friday, they've got to publish something new.
Whether they resurrect the article from the dead or beat it out of someone, or they're going to have that
without
article.
Permission.
Exactly, without permission.
David Bachboy. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
So did you publish your article in the BYU studies, right?
Yeah.
BYU studies did publish it back in 2014.
Do you know why I pulled out of the article? Did I talk about that?
Well, you haven't, but you can reveal it if you wish.
Please do.
It was actually because, Jack Welch was as the editor, for one thing, he was adding his own material to the paper, which I didn't feel like we could decline, right? And he was having you add all these other things to put it into this context. What I wanted to do was just deal with, this is in the text itself, right? But once it starts being put too much in the context of the ancient world, then it makes it look like, for one thing, I'm claiming to know stuff about the ancient world, and I don't know jack about the ancient world. When I want to know about the ancient world, I talk to Trevor, right?
Secondly, I do too.
Secondly, I knew that some of the future things that I might publish might clash with this outlook, right? I didn't want to. I don't want to. Even though some people think of me, since I've come back to the church, as an apologist, that's actually very far from where I'm coming from, and I didn't want to publish what we had done in a way that suggested to the contrary, right? That framed me in that way. And so that was the reason. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry that happened, but it's a good experience. But I like your idea of just let's see. This is the issue, man. I'm not kidding. It's what caused me to quit being an apologist too, is why can't we let the text say what the text says?
Right. And so you'll notice the difference between Brant. By the way, thanks for sharing that, Don. I had
Yeah,
thought that
thank you, Don. That's interesting. Yeah, very
I had
much.
thought, and this is one of the reasons it took so long, because it was like this joint effort, and I'm
Yeah.
putting stuff together, throwing it out to you, and you're working on so many other projects
Yeah.
at the same time. And I just thought you were busy elsewhere. But what was I going to say there? I was going to say that whereas Brant Gardner,
Mhm.
when he's talking about the three gaps of 7 and 4th Nephi, is talking about Mormon being the author.
Right.
I have tried to be at pains in my presentation tonight to not identify any author, but just talk about the author,
Right.
whoever that may be. Obviously, if you got a book, there's an author there somewhere. I think that much is pretty much indisputable, but I'm not trying to identify any particular author.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
See, in so many respects, what we're missing is you did it just right, because instead of worrying about which author or who, that is almost distracting to what you had to say tonight. And because of the way you presented your information, we have had a wonderful exploration with other parts of the Book of Mormon that you didn't even hardly talk about. But I mean,
Yeah.
what a blast, right? Because we're exploring the text. Let's just look at the text. Quit worrying about anything else. What does this silly text say? What does this wonderful text say? Is it interesting? Is it valuable? Is it intriguing enough that, I mean, every one of us have already said, you know, someone ought to look further into that. And we all nominated Cheryl. Oh,
I've got a lot of other things on my plate.
I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you. I promise. How's your book coming, by the
Numerology.
way?
Well, I would, really, I would have to start at like ground zero with numerology and take 10 years to get up to speed on it. So yeah, that would be hard.
Maybe it would only take 7 years, or maybe it would take 12 years. Cheryl.
I love it.
Maybe it would take 20 years, but we would just say it was 7.
I think it would take 144 years, actually.
Yes, 3 times 4. Yeah, 3 times 4 is 12. 12 times 12 times 1,000. Absolutely. Everybody
Yeah.
understands that to be symbolic, except for the Jehovah's Witnesses, I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for coming. I'm going to beg off now. And I'm
It must be
going
getting
to
close to 11:30 in your neck of the woods.
It is. I'm going to stop my recording.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you, Trevor,
guys.
for all
Thanks,
you
It's
do.
been a boatload of
Thanks,
fun.
Art.
Thank you.
And now
Very,
the
very
next
nice.
That was awesome.
talk
Thanks,
we'll
everybody.
have will
Thanks,
be
RFM.
in January. We'll have Carrie and we'll nail down the date soon. All right.
Fabulous.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you all.
I promise it'll be good enough to put you right to sleep. No, I have found some really wonderful stuff on the Mithras liturgy, and it's
Cool.
really fascinating. I'm not kidding.
Yeah,
This is huge.
it
I
is.
promise you'll
It
enjoy
is.
it.
Nice.
I'm looking forward to it, Carrie.
Yeah.
All I
It'll be
ask is
fun.
that you do it outside in a blizzard. That's a
I
little
can do
backyard
that.
professor humor.